Chapter 3 Going Ashore on England's Loneliest Colony. Dancing and church-going. Playmates and friends on Tristan. Farewell. Uncle Tom and Donald. Table Mountain sighted. Cape Town. Far inland. To the Cape of Good Hope. The Island of Penguins. Doncagot. Whaling Station. A walking tour to the Atlantic coast. These islanders are certainly great boatmen. Gosh, how they pulled at the oars and sang and laughed. Soon we were almost right up to the shore. The place we were making for was the only place where one could land. Everywhere else the cliffs rose straight up out of the sea. We could see the women and children come running down to the shore to watch us. Then a great sea swept up which almost turned the boat upside down and threw us towards the beach. Quickly the men of Tristan rowed out again to meet the wave, and then they shot forward swiftly, and the boat touched the bottom. The oarsmen jumped out at once. Each seized the gunwale by his seat, and then they hauled the boat right up on land. We climbed out and walked farther up the shore to greet all the people who were standing there. When we started to walk towards the parson's house, where we were going to stay, a woman got hold of Mother by the arm and dragged her off. She wanted Mother to come and see her house, and of course I went with them. When we got inside, we saw that the room was almost like a Danish peasant cottage of long ago. There was a table, a couple of plain chairs, and an open fireplace. There was also a long bench, with a back. The seat could be lifted, and inside was a bed. All kinds of pictures were hung up on the walls, including some pictures of saints. They were there because the inhabitants are Catholics or something like that. The houses are all built of big blocks of lava, which are placed one on top of the other and are not even plastered together. Rafters are laid across the walls, and on these is placed the roof, which consists of rushes and a tough sort of grass called tussock grass. In some houses they have a proper attic, in others not. Then there is usually a low chimney, or maybe only a hole for the smoke. When we had seen this house, we left and went on to the parson's house. It was distempered white. Next door to it stood the church, which was also distempered white and had a cross over the entrance. The church had a corrugated iron roof. At the parson's house we were received with great friendliness. For lunch we had meat and potatoes and gravy, and the sweet was a kind of apple fritters. They tasted lovely. We were told that the Tristan Islanders did not make butter themselves, and that they had neither cheese nor bread. They ate potatoes, morning, noon, and night. Meat they do not have very often, because they want to keep their cattle, nor do they drink much milk, because the cows don't give very much, and so when they are thirsty and want to drink something, they have, among other things, tea with milk in it. After dinner the cook and I went to have a look round. We saw some donkeys, and were surprised that they had donkeys here. We walked right up to where the mountain starts to rise straight up into the air. There we picked up a couple of pieces of lava to take with us. Tristan had a lot of springs, brooks, and small waterfalls. I was allowed to take off some of my clothes because it was so hot and there was almost no wind, and I was also allowed to go barefoot. It was fun to run around in the grass and play with the other children. There are by no means as many plants on Tristan as there are in Denmark, and the only kind of flower that grows wild is the white daisy. Most of the houses have a little garden in front, and there the islanders grow hollyhocks and pelargoniums. We were given a big bunch of them to take with us on board, and we hung them up to dry so that we could take them with us to Denmark, if possible. We played a lot with the children, and I learnt some English words. All the boys on the island were dressed in Scouts' uniform because of us. They had been given these uniforms by an American warship. The girls wore shawls over their heads, which reached down over their shoulders, and they also had on very pretty long frocks. Everybody wore white home-knitted stockings, and most of them had shoes made of cow skin. The first day we were playing hide-and-seek with the children, and one of the girls suddenly dragged me away. She was about my age, and her name was Lily, and she liked me very much. I went with her to her home, and there she presented me with 2 bird skins and 4 sea elephant fangs. I was terribly pleased, and ran at once to show them to Father. He got the skins disinfected at the parson's house, and the parson told us that Inaccessible Island is the only place in the world where this kind of bird can be found. It is a kind of chicken, and it cannot fly. They call it the island hen. The parson showed Father a letter which he had got from a professor in Berlin, who was willing to pay 56 kroner for every skin of an island hen that he could get hold of. The parson then said that Father ought to send them to this professor, and he gave him 2 more skins. Once a week they had a dance on the island, and the parson had decided that this time it should be held on the day we were there, for he thought that we ought to see this queer old-fashioned dances. The dance started about 3 o'clock. First the parson went and rung the church bell, and soon after almost all the inhabitants came walking towards the school, where the dance was to be held. The school was a long house, built just like the others, only it had no attic. At one end of the room there was a plain deal table covered with green cloth. Next to it stood a couple of chairs, and along the walls there were forms or boxes for the school children to sit on. The school was also used as a village hall on all sorts of festive occasions. We went inside and sat down. A man was there with an accordion, and when everybody had sat down, he started to play. Many of the women had little children sitting on their laps, and if a man came and bowed to such a woman, or more like gave a little nod sideways with his head, then she handed the child over to someone who was not dancing. The couple who came out first on the floor didn't start till 2 or 3 more couples had joined them, and meanwhile they took a few short, slow steps. Soon after the dance was in full swing, The dancers spun each other round at a swishing pace and stamped on the floor, and then they took a few steps. It looked very funny and interesting. Sometimes they danced in this way, and at other times the men and women danced in front of each other without holding hands. In some dances the children joined in, the boys dancing with boys and the girls with girls. Once the little girl, whom I liked so much already, came and wanted to dance with me. I tried and found it great fun. I danced twice with the same little girl, and each time everybody clapped. When the man with the accordion had played several dances, another man started to play on a violin. It sounded very cheerful, and everybody danced again. Now and then a child began to cry, and then its mother, father, or one of their older children went home with it. Just before the people stopped dancing, a woman dragged me off, and she dragged me right off to where she lived. When we got to her house, I followed her into the bedroom, in one corner of which there stood a wooden chest, and out of it she pulled a fine new blue sweater, and told me to put it on. She also pulled out a pair of white stockings, and told me to put them on too. She gave me yet another pair to carry. Then she took me into the kitchen, and brought out a basket, which she filled up with apples. She also put a piece of paper into the basket, on which she had written her name. Then we went back to the school. The people had stopped dancing, and were now all standing outside. I ran up to Mother and showed her what I had been given. The things were all put away in a sack, in which we had brought toys for the children. We asked the parson if he would share out the toys, but he said that the children only cared about clothes, because they didn't have many of them. They had been told that by their parents. However, there were two little girls, one of whom wanted a doll we had brought, and the other one was given an old Santa Claus one of my aunts had once made. When we had finished dancing, we went to church. The inhabitants of Tristan go to church twice daily, because of course they haven't much to amuse themselves with. But the church was very, very beautifully decorated. When the people went in, they first curtsied to the altar before sitting down. I could hear that the parson spoke well, even if I didn't understand very much of what he was saying. The parson had 10 choir boys up by the altar. They helped him with the service, and were also there as a sort of decoration. They were dressed in black, and had on a kind of white blouse. After the service, which lasted a little over an hour, the islanders said that it was too foggy to row out to the Monsoonin, and to our great joy, and also Father's, it was decided that we should spend the night on Tristan. Father wanted to write as much as possible about Tristan, and therefore wanted to get to know as much as possible. Besides, we couldn't even see the Monsoonin. Before supper, I ran about a bit outside, and played with the children, learnt a little English, and teased Mr. Bingo Boss, the parson's dog. On the roof of his kennel there was written, Mr. Bingo Boss, very fierce and cross. Almost every time I passed a house, someone came out and invited me inside. They gave me apples, milk, and sometimes a pair of stockings, or some bird's eggs, which had been blown empty. I got penguin eggs and eggs from mollymawks, and other strange birds. One man gave me a big pumpkin, and he was very proud, because he had grown it himself. Just before we sat down to supper, a woman came with a big, fine head shawl of silk full of apples. She gave it all to us. A little later, several other people came with presents. Some brought those strange tablecloths of penguin feathers, and others small sheepskin rugs. Some brought horns, and others eggs. Some brought stockings, and some brought berries from the mountain. Others gave us little shells, queer stones, and many other things. Finally, we had so many pairs of stockings that I could not carry them all in my arms at once. Among these stockings there were also many pairs for grown-ups. The stockings were made of sheep fleece, which the women had themselves carded and knitted. For supper we again had meat and potatoes, and when we had finished eating, it was quite dark. We were going to sleep in the house next door, for the parson didn't have room for us, and the people who lived in the other house moved over to some friends for the night. Next morning we got up early, and Jan, Tur, and I had time to play a bit outside before breakfast. Father was already up. Later on, Alfred and I went for a walk, and Mother and Christensen went round taking photos. Mother took a snap of the oldest woman on the island, and she was 94 years old. The oldest man was 93. They have no postage stamps on Tristan, and they use a rubber stamp instead. I was allowed to borrow it, and I stamped 3 little pieces of paper with it. I have them still as a souvenir of Tristan. It was late summer on the island when we were there, or rather what we should call autumn. They can't grow such big trees on Tristan as we have in Denmark. There is too much wind. They only have tiny stunted trees and bushes, and not at all such vigorous grass as in Denmark. That is why the cows do not give much milk. They also have berries which are red, and grow on tiny little plants. The inhabitants don't call them anything except just berries. On this same day I went with them and picked some myself, which the children pointed out to me. I could run around and play so well with the children because I had been allowed to go barefoot. I had also taken off some of my other clothes. We jumped from one boulder to the next and played catch, and we also ran down to the shore and played there. Almost as soon as we had eaten, we went to church. As a rule, they used to hold only one proper service in the afternoon, but this day they were celebrating the feast of St. Joseph. During the service, the church was filled with incense. All the children went to church every day. The inhabitants go to church at least once on weekdays, and not less than twice on Sundays. The youngest children sit on their father's or mother's lap. This day, too, everybody had communion, but not the children. It was still so foggy that we could not see the monsoonin, but as usual, Father said that there was nothing to be afraid of. The 2 out there would certainly be able to manage by themselves. On both the days we spent on the island, there was almost no wind. At times it rained just a little. I visited many people that day. There was one man who was called Green, and Alfred and Christensen had their meals at his place. He had invited them to do that. Whenever we got thirsty while playing, we drank from the many springs and brooks on the island. There were also many little waterfalls. There were bigger waterfalls, where some of the brooks flowed over the edge of cliffs, which dropped straight down into the sea. I must not forget to mention that when the islanders need wood for making fires, they have to climb right up almost 2,000 feet, and they have to climb or crawl on hands and knees because they don't know about lifts or other things like that which people in other countries have now invented. In the afternoon we went to visit a man who was ill. Once when he was up in the mountain to pick berries, a rock came rolling down. It struck him on the shins and made 2 big holes in them. Now the hole in the one leg was a bit more than an inch in diameter, but the hole in the other was not very big. Both his legs were quite black. The parson asked us if we would take the man to Cape Town, although it was forbidden to take away any of the islanders from their island, and of course we answered yes. The parson told us that they had once had a visit from a South American ship, which wanted to take the man away with them, but the parson wouldn't let them because the hospitals in South America are not very clean. It was also decided that we should take another man with us. He was a fine young man, about 21 years old, and he wanted very much to go out into the world and see everything. Just before we set off for the Monsoonin, Alfred started complaining of toothache. The parson was also a bit of a doctor at a pinch, and he pulled out 2 of Alfred's teeth. Then he sent a young boy to the church to get some wine, so that Alfred could have a pick-me-up, for that was the only wine they had on the island. It worked very well, and now Alfred has also been to the dentist on Tristan. At about 5 o'clock, when we were about to row over to the Monsoonin, it was no longer foggy. The islanders came with more presents. All the inhabitants of Tristan da Cunha came down to the shore with us, everyone who could walk or crawl, and the dogs and one of the donkeys came too, because the sick man came riding on it. Many of the islanders carried a sack on their back filled with potatoes and apples, which they wanted to give to us. One of them presented us with half a cow, and Green gave us a large piece of lamb. The islanders had been so pleased with our visit because only once a year does a ship visit Tristan, and that is in January. The young man who was coming with us was called Donald Glass, and he went around saying goodbye to everyone with a kiss and a handshake. They all had tears in their eyes. Then we climbed into the boats to make the run through the breakers. The rain poured down just as when we landed. Father and the cook sat in the boat in which the provisions were, while Mother Christensen, Jan Tur, and I sat in the other boat, together with the man who was ill and the other man who was coming with us. And so we headed for the Monsoonin, with steady pulls at the oars. There was a race between the 2 boats, and they both reached the ship at the same time, and drew up one on each side. The sick man, whose name was Tom Rogers, was carried below into the saloon, where Mother quickly prepared a bed for him on the starboard locker. He was terribly pleased that he was being taken to Cape Town to get his legs made well again. By now it was dark, and the men from the 2 boats came down, one after another, into the saloon to say goodbye to the sick man. One man gave me a little sheepskin tablecloth, a penguin tablecloth, and a small leather pouch. We kissed each other. There were many people on Tristan who had kissed us, and it was almost as if we were one big family. One little girl on shore came up to us with her baby brother, in our arms and said, in English of course, "Kiss my little brother." One man gave us 2 hens. Soon after the boats pushed off and we shouted goodbye to each other and cheers went up from all sides, and so we sailed for Cape Town. Uncle Tom, as we called the sick man, told us that in clear weather one can see the highest point on Tristan da Cunha from a distance of 80 sea miles, and the next day it was very fine weather, and we could still see Tristan quite clearly, although we were many miles away. There was a light wind blowing, and towards evening, when we had sailed about 75 miles, and the current had also carried us some miles farther, we could still see the top of the volcano, so we were sure that if it hadn't already become dark by then, we should have seen it for a much greater distance than 80 miles. Uncle Tom's legs looked disgusting, but Mother nursed them so well that we could see a great difference already when he had been on board a couple of days. Maybe the change in diet helped also. We all believed that we should reach Cape Town before the 31st, because we were having a favorable wind. Uncle Tom sat on deck every day. One day, when we were doing a grand cleaning up, we saw the smoke from a steamer far astern. The steamer came nearer and nearer, and it turned out to be a Japanese ship we had seen in Buenos Aires. Its name was written in Japanese letters, and below in European letters. We signaled to them, and they told us our longitude. We can only measure our latitude because we have no chronometer. We were also told our latitude, for the sun had not been shining the previous days, and we had not been able to measure it. The Japanese asked our name, and we signaled Monsoonin. Finally we signaled goodbye and happy voyage to each other, dipped our flags, and so we parted. The Japanese steamer was going to call at Cape Town on her way to Japan. For a few days we had good weather. At times we had to tack, but most of the time there was a favorable wind blowing. Occasionally we had rain, but mostly the sun shone. One day we saw a lot of snow-white birds which were whirling round in the air just like snowflakes. The inhabitants of Tristan call them night birds, because at night these birds find their way to their fires. However, on March 31st, we were not in Cape Town and couldn't even see land. That day the weather was unpleasant. There was wind and rain, and next morning at breakfast, Father told me that for the first time the weather had made thorough April fools of us. Father said that in the morning they had reefed the mainsail, partly because he wanted to try out the new wire pendant, and partly because the weather looked like becoming really nasty, but it turned out fairly good after all. Uncle Tom's legs had already become so much better that there were now no holes at all, and no matter came from them either, but his wounds were of the kind which break open again. But Mother is such a good doctor and nurse, we hardly have time to get ill and be allowed a holiday from school before she has us cured again. I could speak so much English now that I could chat with Uncle Tom, and I got to know a lot of things from him. He said that no stranger had slept on Tristan within the memory of man, and that we were the first to do it. I asked Uncle Tom what a lot of things were called in English, and he told me their names, and by also asking Father and Mother what various things were called, I got to know quite a lot of English in time. One day, when the weather was specially fine, with plenty of sunshine and a good wind, Uncle Tom asked if he could borrow a gimlet, a knife, and a piece of wood. Then he carved a fine whaleboat for Tur, with a sail of cloth and a rudder. Later on he made one for Jan and one for me. One day we brought all the provisions up on deck to be dried, and then Uncle Tom showed us how they pile up potatoes on Tristan. He showed me with brown beans, and he arranged them in this fashion. Sometimes Uncle Tom would borrow Carl's accordion, and one day, when he was playing to us, Father discovered that he was playing an old Danish sailor song, which Father knew. He had probably learnt it from a shipwrecked sailor. When we are out at sea, we climb up aloft. It is great fun to stand up on the cross trees, or on the main top, and to watch out for whales, ships, or something else. Early one morning, when it was still pitch dark, I was woken up by a crash. I hurried on deck to find out what had happened, and saw that it was the main gaff, which had crashed down. The throat halyard had been broken, and the gaff was dangling against the mast from the peak halyard. When I came up on deck in the morning, a new throat halyard had been made, everything was mended, and the sail was set. On April 5th, we thought that we should surely see land the next day, and we were quite right. Early on the next morning, we sighted land. It was Table Mountain. We did not succeed in sailing straight in to Cape Town in the afternoon, as we had expected, for the wind dropped. On Sunday, April 6th, there was also a dead calm, and several times it happened that we sailed through some sort of peculiar red water. It looked as if somebody had spilt a big pot of red lead. We asked Donald what it was, and he answered that it was well shed. That means something which nice people don't talk about. For dinner, we had porridge with prunes. We hadn't had it for a long time, and that is why I mention it. Soon after dinner, we saw a turtle straight ahead. When it had come close to our bows, Christensen managed to hook the boat hook in its skin underneath the shell, but before Father had time to throw a noose round its neck, the boat hook slipped out, and the turtle dived deep down and swam far away. We were very annoyed, because turtle soup would have tasted lovely, and the shell would have been great fun to have, as well as being beautiful and unusual. Father and the others said that if we had had a second boat hook, we would have caught it. There were a lot of birds floating on the surface of the water, and Uncle Tom said that maybe we could catch one of them by means of a line and a hook, with a little piece of meat on it. We ought to tie a small piece of wood to the line almost at its very end, so that it should not sink. We tried for a long time, but the birds were full up because they find their food easily when the sea is calm, and so they didn't bite. Not long after we saw another turtle. It was not swimming straight ahead of us, but we gave the helm a turn and steered towards it until it was close to our bows, like the other one had been. As we had seen it some time, we had prepared a long pole to catch it, and at the end of the pole we had tied the shark hook. Father was holding the pole, but before he could get the shark hook into the turtle's skin, he tickled it a bit in the side by accident, and the next second it waved goodbye with its flippers and disappeared. We were even more fed up this time than when the last one disappeared, because this turtle had a lot of mussels stuck on its shell. That was because the turtle was so old. Both the turtles were almost 1 meter in diameter. In the afternoon, we had cocoa and biscuits instead of coffee, because it was Ch3's birthday. There were 2 white and 2 red candles burning on his birthday table, because now he was 4 years old. Father and Mother gave him a big book with pictures of animals and birds in, and Jan gave him a bridge which could be swung round to the side just like long bro, and which he had made himself. Jan also gave him some candles so that he could light them himself some other day. I gave him a wooden dagger with a leather sheath. Some little time after this, Carl fixed a small fishing net on the end of a long pole. He gave it to me to try and fish with. As the sea was so calm, there were a lot of little animals shooting round in the water, but I could only catch one kind. They were a sort of small crab, which shone in many colors. Their eyes were set on stalks and were big and blue. I caught many of them, and Jan also caught some. They swam very fast in the water, but they were no bigger than your nail. On Tuesday, April 8th, the weather was still almost calm, but in the afternoon, when Father asked me to take the wheel for a bit, the wind veered round so much that we could hardly keep our course. By now we could see the coast so clearly that we could distinguish the various houses from one another, and could see that they were white with red roofs. However, Cape Town itself was not yet in sight, as it was hidden behind a mountain, which is called Lion's Rump, because there is another mountain a little way from it called the Lion's Head. Together the mountains are called the Lion. A ledge of rocks with a row of trees on it runs from the Lion's Head to the Rump. The trees haven't been planted, and they look exactly like a mane. That is why they are called the Lion's Mane. It looks very funny. Soon we could see the end of Cape Town's long mole, and then a couple of houses on the outskirts of the town. When we had got as near as that, we saw a motor boat come chugging towards us. It had a Swedish ship chandler on board, who asked if he could bring some of his wares on board the next morning. So we ordered meat, tomatoes, cabbage, and a few other little things. Soon after, another ship chandler came along. He was a Norwegian. We told him that we had already ordered goods, but when we had chatted a bit with him, he said that one day when we had time, we should come and visit him and his wife and 2 little girls. Not long after, we saw the pilot boat, and in a few minutes, the pilot was on board. Father said that we had no money, and anyway could manage by ourselves, but the pilot said that he would very much like to come all the same. We had thought at first that we should be anchored by 5 o'clock, but the wind dropped and we didn't get into the harbor till 7. By that time, lights were already twinkling in every part of the town. We let go the anchor, and the pilot went below to have a glass of whiskey. We still had half a bottle left. The crew and Father always got some when they had had a hard spell. We lay here well for a time. We had sailed just inside the mole, but were not allowed to go any farther until the immigration officers had been on board. Next morning the wind blew and it rained, and everything looked wet and unpleasant. We hoisted the signal flag, which means that one wants the immigration officers to come on board as soon as possible. When they arrived, they said that Uncle Tom and Donald had to pay $50 each before they could land. That was a nice thing to say, of course. Uncle Tom and Donald didn't get ashore for the time being, although Uncle Tom needed so badly to be taken to hospital with those legs of his. Next morning, Father asked if I wanted to come ashore with him. Of course I answered, yes please. We got ready and then went ashore. We went to many different places, but first of all to the Danish Council. Father thought he would be a Dane, because his name was Jep, but he was an Englishman. He was a millionaire in pounds sterling, and was very hard of hearing. He took us into a fine restaurant, where we had tea and cakes. A splendid orchestra was playing there, and that was the only restaurant with an orchestra in the whole town. When Father had finished all his business, we went down to the mole and saw that the Monsoonen had been moved out into a little harbor to which Father had said Christensen could sail her while he was ashore. Many visitors came on board every day, and among them some people from Tristan. They were friends of Uncle Tom, and they promised to see to it that he would be allowed ashore, but they weren't able to keep their promise. Father went ashore to try and arrange the matter, but the immigration officers always made all kinds of excuses. One day when Father was ashore with Jan Jensen, noticed that we were drifting. We thought that we had again lost our anchor, but that seemed almost impossible because the sea was so calm. We hurriedly dropped the second anchor, and when we got anchor number 1 hauled on board, we discovered that the chain had got twisted round the flukes, and in this way managed to drag the anchor off the bottom. One afternoon, an English lady paid us a visit. She took a fancy to Ch3 and asked him if he wanted to come ashore with her, and as Ch3 always liked her very much, he said yes. He got permission to go with her, and returned at 6 o'clock. He brought back several toys. That day some young men had also visited us on board. They promised to come and sing and play for us in the evening, and just after 8 o'clock they came along. Jan, Ch3 and I were in bed, but I was allowed to get up again for a while. An older man was also there. He was a lawyer who looked like an old sailor. He owned a yacht, and it was from that yacht that all the young men had come. They were all English except one, who was a Dane, and who could play the piano. He could only play by ear, but he gave us many songs, both English and Danish. They had also brought an accordion with them, and while one of them played, the other sang. The lawyer beat time with his feet, and that night we went to bed late, for it was a real sailor's evening. Another day we were invited to some Danish people called Christensen. They had one son who was killed in the Great War. One of their daughters had also died, but they still had 3 sons and 4 daughters left. We went with the Christensens to the zoo and saw there, among other things, a mother ape who was jumping around in her cage, and all the time her little baby ape was holding on to her tummy. In the evening we went to the cinema with the younger members of the Christensen family. I understood nearly everything that was written on the screen. We saw a very good film which was called Colin's Son. I hadn't been to a cinema since we were in Denmark, and we didn't get back on board till 11:30. The weather was quite calm almost every day, and we could see the high, flat mountain, which is called Table Mountain, and the little wagon which hangs on a cable and goes up to the very top. It cost 15 shillings to go up to the top in it, and that is very expensive. But of course one can also walk. It takes a long time, but I think that would be much more fun than going in the wagon. Both Uncle Tom's wounds broke open again now because he had walked about a bit too much, and we all thought that it was barbarous of the English people not to want to take him ashore to a hospital. Donald hadn't been on land yet either, because the law forbade him to go ashore and have a look round or go to the pictures with the crew, although he was signed on with the Monsoonin, just like the others, and did some jobs, though they were not very important. But in the end, they let Donald land, and Uncle Tom went to the hospital. Tristan da Cunha is, of course, only an expense for the English government, and once England offered to take all the islanders to Cape Town, but as they didn't all want to leave their island, the English government became angry and said that they must never leave it. So we had broken the law when we had taken Uncle Tom and Donald with us. It seems to me that the English ought to establish a whaling station on Tristan. Then they could learn to hunt whales there, and the island would be of use to the English. One day, a Dane called Le Boel took us in a car to a village called Parle. The first interesting thing we saw was a carriage drawn by 8 mules, 2 and 2 abreast. On our way we drove past a churchyard, which was 4 miles long. We drove on a road, which was quite straight, and 8 miles long. When we got to Parle, we drove almost up to the top of mountain, and on our way up, we stopped in a very pretty spot. A house stood there, and a woman came out to us with some figs, which she had just picked, and we also got a pomegranate each. It took us more than an hour to walk from there right up to the top of the mountains, and the top was a gigantic boulder. Iron rods had been fastened in the mountain all the way up, and there was an iron chain fixed in the rods for people to hold on to, because it was a very steep climb. Father Jan, Tur, and I went right up to the top, but Mother and Mr. Le Boel were too tired to do that. There was a very good echo up there, which could speak Danish. Father tried it and shouted, "What is the Danes' biggest treat?" And we got "eat" for an answer. On our way home, we stopped at a house which belonged to some relatives of Mr. Le Boel. The husband was a policeman, and there was also a man in the house whom he had arrested. There we were given a kind of apple called Queen's apple. We also had coffee before driving on. But before we went home, we also went to see Mr. Le Boel's house. I didn't like him very much because he went about praising himself the whole time, but that was maybe because he had just taken us out on such a nice trip, and he couldn't stop himself from giving vent to his feelings. On April 17th, we again had a lot of visitors, whale hunters and people from shore, and next day Jan and I sculled the lifeboat over to a three-masted schooner, which was lying not far from us, and paid a visit on board. There was only one man there, and he showed us over the ship and gave us tea. On the Saturday we visited the harbor master and his wife. On Easter Sunday we went for a long drive with a Dane whose name was Jorgensen. He drove us right out on to the Cape of Good Hope, and during the whole of that trip we could see the sea and such a lot of other strange things. We drove past a beautiful place, the Bay of St. Anne, and stopped at many other strange and beautiful places. We stopped at Kafir village, and Mother took snaps of it. It consisted of a lot of tumble-down old huts, which looked like hovels in the Bay of Gondo. There were a lot of screaming children running about and playing. The village was just by the shore, and we sat down and ate the food which Mr. Jorgensen had brought. When we had finished eating, Jan, Tur, and I started to paddle and play in the sand. We also came by another Kafir village, in which the huts were made of wooden frames, on which old sacks had been tied. We drove almost the whole time up in the mountains. The road had been cut out of the rock, and sometimes it looked as if we were just about to drive down into the abyss below. When we had been driving for a long time, we came at last to the Cape of Good Hope. We stopped the car and started to walk along a long, sloping path which leads to the old lighthouse. This is no longer used because it is too high up when there is a fog or the clouds come down over the mountains. When we had seen it, we walked along another path down to the new lighthouse, which stands right out almost at the very tip of the Cape of Good Hope. To the south of the old lighthouse, only a few steps away, the rock slopes down very steeply. We took photographs of it. Mother became giddy, and Father very nearly too. On our way home, we stopped at Mr. Jorgensen's house, where we met his wife and daughter and had tea and cakes. Then we drove into Cape Town and visited some Danish people called Jacobsen. We had supper with them. The son, who spoke Danish well, gave Jan, Tur, and me each an Easter egg. It was great fun talking with the daughter, who knew only a tiny, weeny bit of Danish. We didn't get back on board till midnight. On April 23rd, Donald came on board to say goodbye. He had tears in his eyes and thanked us because we had taken him with us to Cape Town. He told us that he had got a job and that Uncle Tom's legs were much better. Next day, a Danish man visited us who knew my mother's brothers. Their name is Thorn, and he had been to school with some of them. Mother and he talked about all the terrible teachers they had both known at their old school. It was funny that they had known each other like that in the days gone by. In the morning, a photographer came along with a film camera and took a film of Mother and me while we sat darning stockings and sweaters and talking to each other, and a film of Jan and me playing catch in the rigging, and another one of us and Tur repairing Jan's ship, which was broken. Then he asked us if we would take off our clothes so that Christensen could give us a shower bath while we were being filmed. We had not been having shower baths here in Cape Town because it seemed too cold. but now we didn't think it was so cold after all, and after we had a shower, I walked for fun right out to the end of the bowsprit. The photographer filmed that as well, and when he had taken pictures of all sorts of places on the ship, he went away, after first having given Ch3 half a crown. On April 24th, towards the evening, we weighed anchor and stood out to sea. There was a faint breeze blowing, and Alfred said that at that rate we wouldn't reach the three-masted schooner by the next morning. Soon after, however, the wind began to freshen, and soon it was quite strong, and we started to sail faster. We had never dreamt of having so many Easter eggs as we had got in Cape Town. I hadn't even counted them, as I always used to do. We had also received so much toffee that we almost needed a second monsoonin to carry it all. We were called early next morning, for we lay anchored by an island which we called Penguin Island, but its name is really Dawson Island. We intended to put in here before sailing on to Saldanha Bay and St. Helena. There were a lot of penguins swimming round quite close to the monsoonin. They kept on diving and could stay down quite a long time. They swam much faster under water than on top, and it seemed to me that they looked really like sharks when they were swimming beneath the surface. The island was rocky and had a sandy beach. There was a lighthouse on the side on which ships mostly pass. We took with us a bag of apples, which had been given to us in Cape Town, to give to the man in charge of the island. He had a lot of Kaffir boys working for him, who collected penguin eggs and packed them in boxes ready to be shipped on the steamer, which calls at the island once a week. The islanders also collect the penguin manure, for it is the best manure in the world. Jensen, Max, Cookie, Father, Jan, Ch3, and I rowed ashore and landed by a big stone, to which we tied the boat. First of all, we walked on the shore and watched the penguins waddling about and throwing themselves head first into the water. They looked very funny, because they were almost like human beings. Bathing was in full swing. There were a lot of holes in the sand, and out of almost every hole a penguin pushed its head. The ground was quite undermined by these holes, and every now and then one of us trod through the sand and right on to a penguin. When this happened, the penguin luckily had no time to bite, for usually if one comes too close to a penguin with one's foot or hand, it bites. Mother wanted to try and take a close-up photo of a penguin, but it bit the camera, and there is still a scratch on it. Father tried to put his hat over one of them, and you can't imagine how it bit the hat. I was lucky and didn't get bitten. Many of the penguins were sitting on eggs, and in many of the holes there were only eggs. We very much wanted to take some, but that was punished by a heavy fine. We had special permission from the government to land on this island, and Father had a card from the government to show to the man in charge of the island. The penguins here did not have a big yellow feather on each side of the head like those on Tristan, but then there are so many different kinds of penguin. We now went towards the manager's house, and all the time we were walking between penguins, and when they looked back at us, they first turned one side of the head towards us, and then the other. If we stood close behind them, they turned their head this way and that, and almost right round, so that soon you didn't know which part of the head was up and which down. We saw a sweet little baby penguin walking with its mother along the road, and we saw many more young ones, but those were bigger. The white breast of nearly all the penguins shone like silver, and the black feather coats on their back were also very elegant. We passed several square rooms made of brick, but without any roofs. We peered over the wall of one of them, and saw that there were heaps of dead penguins inside. These are also used for manure. The negroes went round collecting the dead penguins, and carried them to these kind of rooms, or penguin churchyards, as we called them. At last we came to the manager's house. He was called Tony Dalmida. Both his father and grandfather had lived here in charge of the island. He had 4 children, 3 of whom were at a boarding school on the mainland, while the 4th was at home. We were invited in and had tea. His wife presented Jan, Tur, and me with a bag of nuts and raisins. We were also given a lot of different kinds of shells and mussels. Mother was given 3 table mats with shells sewn on the edges. Then we went down to the shore on the opposite side, to that where we had landed with the boat, and there we saw the penguins walking down to the water in big flocks. When they reached the edge of the sea, they walked a little bit out and then started to swim. When the penguins walked in big flocks, they looked just like real little people going to church in their Sunday clothes. Jan Tur and I ran about bare-legged in the sand, and played and looked for mussel shells, but we couldn't stay long because we had to get back on board so that we could take advantage of the favorable wind. When we got back to the manager's house, he asked us if we would like a sheep. "A sheep?" Father asked. "Yes," the man answered almost gruffly. "Don't be a fool, don't you want a sheep?" We said yes and thank you, of course, and then the man sent some of his negroes to catch one of the sheep they had on the island and kill it. They also had a couple of mules, a cow, and a dog. Father Jan Tur and I were taken on board in the manager's motorboat, for he wanted to come along with us to see the monsoonin. Our own boat was towed, and in her sat Jensen, Cookie, Max, Mother, and the manager's wife and little daughter. When we were on board, they had hardly time to look at the monsoonin properly, for they got seasick at once and went back home. We waved goodbye to them and dipped our flag. When they got home, they let off fireworks, because they didn't have a flag which they could dip in return. With the wind astern, we sailed towards Saldanha Bay. It is a big bay which has a couple of small towns on its coast and 2 whaling stations. The owner of one of the whaling stations, Donkogot, has offered to careen the monsoonin free of charge. His name was Johnson. Father was very pleased about that. And the monsoonin had already waited for a long time to have the seaweed and the barnacles scraped off her bottom and a new coat of paint put on, Father said that a couple of sea cows could easily graze off the bottom of the Monsoonin. We managed to sail into the bay and cast anchor shortly before midnight, and the next day we sailed right close to the whaling station and dropped anchor a little way outside. We thought that we could manage to get away from there in a couple of days, but we were wrong. The same day Father was told that the cradle, a sort of low carriage which is pulled up on shore on rails, was broken, so that it would probably take 2 or 3 weeks before we could get the ship up on shore. One Sunday Christensen, Jensen, Jan, and I rowed out to a little island which lay not far from us. It is called Mew, that is South African and means seagull. We called it Seagull Island because there were so many birds on it, and most of them were seagulls. We found many seagull feathers, and I'm going to make myself a red Indian hat out of them. The one from the Argentine is too good for everyday use. We also found a lot of queer shells, and when I showed them to Father, he asked if Jan and I would like to come with him to the Atlantic coast, for we were certain to find even stranger shells there. Of course, we wanted to come terribly much, and it was then decided that in the afternoon Jan and I would go with Father to the Atlantic coast. We started after coffee. When you have got to the whaling station, you have to walk 1 sea mile right across country in a westerly direction, and then you come to the Atlantic coast. When we reached the shore, we found that the pier where the whalers landed was made out of old wrecks. They were beautiful old ships. Some were made of wood and some of iron, which could no longer sail, and which had been left here. Then they sank, and a pier had been built on top of them. In this way, it wasn't difficult or very expensive to build a pier, and it looked romantic, but it was sad with all those old masts from the wrecks sticking up out of the water. When we had walked past a couple of houses by the harbor, we came to a place where there were a lot of low bushes with thorns, and they grew fairly close to each other all the way down to the ocean. It was not so easy to walk between them without getting pricked, and Jan found it specially difficult because he had no stockings on. The narrow path which we took curved in and out between the bushes, and we got scratched a couple of times, but we thought it great fun, really, and after having walked for about an hour and a half, we came to a stretch of high dunes, which hid the Atlantic Ocean from our eyes. Soon after, we were on the other side. How lovely and wide the beach was, and there were plenty of big blue mussel shells. Some of them were as much as 15 centimeters long, but of course such a size is nothing very unusual. When we had got down to the shore, we walked a long way to the right until we came to a huge stone, which lay a bit out in the water. I thought it would be fun to climb up on it, and as the stone was very high and its sides were steep, we helped each other up. When we had reached the top, we ate some nuts I had brought with me in my pocket. Up there we could see the breakers properly. I had never before seen such beautiful breakers. The enormous waves from the Atlantic came rolling in, broke, and then threw themselves on the beach. But first they threw themselves against the boulder on which we were sitting, so that the water spurted right up to us. We soon saw that it would be impossible to paddle here, for even if we didn't stand in the water, but only in the sand near the edge, one of those enormous waves might come and wash some of the sand away, and we might be dragged out too and get whirled out among the waves, and never get out alive again. After we had sat on the stone for a while, we climbed down and started to walk in a southerly direction. Then we noticed that there were plenty of different kinds of shells a bit higher up on the beach. We found some round shells which looked more like negro nuts than anything else, and another kind which had bright red stripes on the outside, and on the inside was covered in mother of pearl. We found one shell which was made entirely of mother of pearl, and was almost as big as a hand. There were many more like that, but they were all in bits and pieces. We also found many shells which were twisted round like snail shells. After a while we had walked so far that we had got to a place where the coast bent inwards. Here we could bathe in safety, for all the waves flowed in towards the bay, and therefore alongside that part of the coast where we were standing. But all the same, we never went into the water. For there were jellyfish, and it was so late that it had already become cold. After we had been jumping round on the rocks for ages, we started to walk back again, but first we went to a house to get some water because we were thirsty. Nobody was at home, but we caught sight of a water tank, which had a tap fixed to it. However, we never took any of the water, for on the tank it was written in large letters that people who were discovered taking water from the tank would be treated as thieves. The inhabitants had written that because they were very short of water. There is no well near Saldanha Bay, and the rain water was made to run from the rain pipe on the roof, through another pipe, and straight into the tank. The people who live by the bay hardly get enough water to drink. It doesn't rain here very often. So we started walking back to the Monsoonin. On our way home we found some strange flowers, which we brought with us on board. We also found a very queer plant. The stalk was quite red and had a sort of crown, which consisted of a lot of other stalks growing outwards. They were almost 40 centimeters long, almost as thick as the main stalk itself, and also red. They grew in such a way that they formed the half of a ball. At the tip of each of these stalks sat a red flower, which was crinkled up in a funny fashion. The whole plant looked like a flower. We found another one like it, but this one was withered. When we had been walking for some time, Father caught sight of a tree with a trunk which looked like the trunk of a knotty old apple tree. But when we bent it over, we discovered that it was a plant, and that the trunk was just a juicy stalk which could bend easily. On our way home, Father carried the shells in a bag we had brought. Jan carried the withered flower, and I the red plant, and the little flowers we had found. When we got to the whaling station, Father hailed the Monsoonin, and Carl fetched us in the boat.